Still, the silver spoon hovered in the air as David's words cut through the quiet dinner. Mom, we need to talk about rent. My grip tightened, the weight of his audacity settling into my bones. As the words sank in, the room seemed to close in around me, the scent of roast chicken suddenly unbearable. Rent? In my own house? That's when the truth hit. I met his eyes, steady, unwavering. This was my home, and I wouldn't let him take it from me. I leaned forward, my voice cold. How dare you? All right. Before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Helen had spent the afternoon preparing the dinner with a sense of quiet anticipation. It had been a while since she'd had both Emma and David over, and she was hoping for a peaceful evening, one where they could reconnect, talk, and enjoy a family meal. The house smelled of roasted chicken and fresh bread, the warm, inviting scent of comfort. She set the table with care, placing the china and crystal in their usual spots, her heart fluttering just a little as she imagined how nice it would be to have her daughter and son-in-law under the same roof again. The doorbell rang, and she wiped her hands on her apron before hurrying to answer. "Hi, Mom." Emma's voice was a burst of energy as she stepped in, holding a bottle of wine and a dessert she'd made. Behind her, David entered more slowly, his gaze scanning the house like he was already assessing something. "Evening, David." Helen greeted him with a smile, though there was something about his posture, that tension in his shoulders, that caught her attention. "Thanks for inviting us," he said, his tone flat, as if it were a chore more than a favor. They made their way into the dining room, where dinner was already set. The conversation flowed easily at first, Emma and Helen chatting about her latest project at work, reminiscing about old family holidays. David, as usual, was quieter, his eyes darting around the room every so often, as though something was gnawing at him. Helen could feel it, a subtle shift in the air, but she chose to ignore it, determined to make the evening go smoothly. Then, just as she was about to offer seconds of potatoes, David set down his fork and cleared his throat, his voice breaking through the comfortable hum of the conversation. "Mom, we need to talk." Helen froze mid-motion, the silver spoon still in her hand. The way he said it, so blunt, sent a chill down her spine. Emma's fork paused halfway to her mouth, her face shifting into an unreadable expression. "About what?" Helen asked cautiously, setting the spoon down and turning her full attention to him. David leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Well, look, we've been staying here for a while now, and I think it's time we talk about rent." Helen blinked, sure she hadn't heard him correctly. "Rent?" David nodded. "Yeah. I mean, it's fair, right? We're living here. We're using the space. And I'm just thinking it'd make things more equal if we both contributed." The words hung in the air, as if they were still settling into place. Helen's heart began to pound in her chest. She blinked again, unsure how to process what had just been said. "David," she said slowly, trying to keep her voice steady, "this is my house. I own it. I've lived here for years. You think I'm going to pay rent for my own home?" Emma shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting nervously between the two of them, but said nothing. David leaned forward slightly, trying to push his point. "I'm not saying it's a big deal, but I think it's only fair. You've always talked about fairness, right? It's just—" He faltered, realizing that Helen's expression wasn't one of agreement. "I'm just trying to be practical here." Helen could feel the heat rise in her chest, a mixture of confusion and outrage swirling inside her. "Practical?" she repeated, her voice tighter now. "You're asking me to pay rent in my own home, and that's practical to you?" David's gaze hardened, his jaw set in determination. "I'm just saying, you've always talked about keeping things fair between all of us. This is part of that." "No." Helen cut in firmly, standing up from the table. This is my home, David, and you will not manipulate me into thinking it's anything else. You're not going to take advantage of me. Her voice had grown sharp, and she could feel her pulse racing. David paused as if stunned by her immediate resistance. He looked at her, trying to find a way to justify his words, but Helen wasn't backing down. You want fairness? How about respect? I've been more than generous, but this is where I draw the line. The room fell silent, the tension thick and palpable. Emma, still seated, glanced at David, her face pale, but Helen's eyes never left David's. Well, I'm just trying to keep things fair, David muttered, but it was clear now that he wasn't sure how to continue. Helen's voice softened slightly, but it was no less determined. The only fair thing here, David, is that I live in my home without being asked for rent. And that's final. David, his face flushing with frustration, stared at her for a moment longer before turning his gaze to the floor, his hands fidgeting with the edge of the table. Helen took a breath, feeling her resolve solidify. You're welcome to stay, but you need to understand your place here. I will not be pushed around. The tension hung in the air long after the words were spoken, and Helen knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning. The silence that followed Helen's words was thick, heavy with tension. David stared at her, visibly flustered. His face flushed with frustration as his mind scrambled for something to say. This wasn't how he expected the conversation to go. He had anticipated resistance, sure, but not this level of firmness. Not from Helen. Emma, sensing the growing unease, set her fork down with a quiet clink. She glanced at David and then at her mother, her face pale with uncertainty. David. Maybe we should just… No. David cut her off, his voice harsh, as if he were trying to regain control of the situation. He turned back to Helen, jaw tight. I'm just asking for fairness, that's all. I'm not trying to make things difficult. Helen met his gaze, her posture unwavering. Fairness? David, you're trying to make demands in my own home. That's not fairness. That's manipulation. David flinched, his eyes flickering with a mix of anger and disbelief. I'm not manipulating anyone. I'm just saying, it's only fair that I contribute. Helen shook her head, her frustration simmering beneath the surface. I've been more than generous with you and Emma. I've let you stay here without question. But asking me to pay rent in my own house? Her voice hardened, a quiet strength cutting through the tension. That's where I draw the line. David's expression wavered for a moment. The anger didn't disappear, but it was tempered with a flicker of doubt. He opened his mouth to argue but found himself at a loss for words. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. He could see the resolve in Helen's eyes. She wasn't going to back down. Helen let the silence stretch, letting the weight of her words settle. This house is mine, she said firmly. I don't owe you rent, and I won't pay it. If you want to stay, you'll have to respect that. David's hands clenched into fists on the table, his frustration palpable. I'm not asking for much, he muttered, trying to hold on to his argument, but it was weak now. The words felt hollow in his own mouth. Helen's gaze never wavered. You've been taking advantage of me, David. I've given you space. I've given you support. But this… She motioned around the room, her voice steady but firm. This is my home, and I'll decide how it runs. Emma's eyes darted back and forth between the two of them, but she remained silent. She knew that any attempt to intervene would only make things worse. She could feel the walls closing in, the familiar tension from years of family dynamics bubbling to the surface. David finally exhaled sharply, the fight draining from him. He looked down at his hands, then at the door. Fine, he muttered, his voice cold. But don't think I'll forget this. Helen stood tall, her expression resolute. You're welcome to stay, but only if you understand your place here. If you can't respect that, then you're free to leave. David stood abruptly, chair scraping harshly against the floor. Without another word, he walked out of the room, the door slamming behind him with finality. Helen remained standing, her chest tight. The moment felt monumental, the weight of what had just happened settling heavily in her bones. Emma didn't move, her eyes still fixed on the door where David had left. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. What now? Helen let out a deep breath, her shoulders sagging just a little, though her determination remained intact. Now, we move forward, she said quietly but firmly. And we do it on my terms. The sound of David's departure still echoed in the room. Helen knew this wasn't the end of the battle, it was just the beginning. The door slammed shut with a heavy finality, leaving the house in a thick, suffocating silence. Helen stood still, her chest tight with the adrenaline of the confrontation. She had stood her ground, but she wasn't sure what would come next. The uneasy quiet that followed David's exit felt more like an absence than peace. Emma sat at the table, eyes glued to the empty space where David had just been. She hadn't said much since he left, and Helen could feel the weight of her daughter's silence pressing down on her. Finally, Emma spoke, her voice small. Mom, you really think this is the right way to handle it? You can't just push him out. Helen took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I'm not pushing him out. I'm standing up for myself. This is my home. He has no right to make demands. Emma's face twisted in uncertainty. But he's my husband, Mom. He's just trying to make things fair. He's upset. Helen's heart sank. There it was, the crack she feared. Her daughter, torn between loyalty to her mother and her husband. Fair? Helen repeated, her voice hardening. What about me, Emma? What about what's fair for me? Emma lowered her gaze, her hands gripping the edges of the table. I'm just saying, he didn't mean it like that. Maybe you could meet halfway? Helen's stomach churned, the sting of her daughter's words sharp. She had never thought she would be in this position, having to explain to Emma why she deserved to be treated with respect. But this was no time for compromise. No, Emma. There is no middle ground when it comes to my own home. The air between them grew thick with tension. Emma didn't respond, her silence louder than anything she could have said. Just then, David's footsteps echoed in the hall, heavy and deliberate. He reappeared in the doorway, his face flushed with frustration. We need to talk, he said, his voice sharp. Helen stood, her spine straightening. David, we've already talked. You know where I stand. No, you don't get it, David shot back, his tone cold. You're being completely unreasonable. I'm trying to work with you here, and you just keep shutting me down. Helen's gaze never wavered. I'm not being unreasonable. I'm protecting myself. I won't let you manipulate me into paying rent for my own home. David's eyes narrowed, his hands clenching into fists. I'm not trying to manipulate you. I'm asking for fairness. I'm contributing, I'm here, and all I'm asking is for something in return. Fairness? Helen repeated. This isn't about fairness. This is about you trying to control the situation. I've been more than generous, David, but this stops now. David stepped closer, his voice rising. If things don't change, I'm leaving. I won't stay here and be treated like this. Helen stood firm, her voice unwavering. Then leave. I'm not going to beg you to stay. If you can't respect that this is my house, then you're free to go. David's face twisted with frustration, but he didn't argue further. He turned on his heel, storming out of the room. The door slammed behind him with an angry bang. Helen exhaled, her body still tense, but something within her softened. The battle wasn't over, but she had won this round. Emma remained silent, eyes still trained on the door where David had just exited. What now? Emma asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Helen's heart ached. She didn't want this rift with her daughter, but there was no other way. Now, we move on. I'm not backing down. This is my home. The words felt both final and uncertain, and Helen knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. The days after the confrontation settled into a thick silence, but it wasn't peaceful. David's behavior grew more passive-aggressive with each passing day. He no longer made direct demands, but his sharp comments and resentful looks became a regular part of the atmosphere. Helen could feel the resentment building between them, a low hum that never quite went away. It started with small things. David would leave his dishes in the sink, clothes scattered around the house, and refuse to help with the chores, all while acting as if he were doing nothing wrong. When Helen would ask him to pitch in, he'd sigh loudly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Must be nice to have all this space and not have to contribute. His words, meant to sting, left a sour taste in the air. Helen refused to engage. She had made her stance clear, and she wasn't about to let his manipulations pull her back in. But it didn't stop him from trying. Each time she asked him to clean up after himself, he'd comply, but only with an exaggerated reluctance, his actions speaking louder than his words. Emma, caught in the middle, was beginning to show signs of strain. Helen could see the weight of it in her daughter's eyes. Every glance between her and David was loaded with unspoken tension. At dinner one night, after a particularly tense exchange between her mother and husband, Emma finally spoke up. "Mom," she said quietly, her voice unsure. "David's feeling humiliated. I think you need to cut him some slack. He's trying to keep the peace." Helen's heart sank. She had known this would come. David was playing the victim, trying to turn Emma against her. But hearing her daughter say it, hearing her voice so small and torn, hurt more than she expected. "You think I'm the one who's being unfair?" Helen's voice was calm, but the sting was evident. "I'm the one who's been taken advantage of, Emma. I've let him stay here without paying rent. I've given him space. And I'm not going to be manipulated into feeling guilty. I'm just saying, maybe if you both tried harder." Emma trailed off, not knowing how to finish the sentence, caught between two people she loved. Helen shook her head, trying not to let the frustration show. "I'm done trying to make him comfortable, Emma. This is my home. I won't let him disrespect me in it." The conversation was cut short by a loud thud from the living room. David had kicked over a chair in frustration. His voice echoed from the hallway, calling out to Helen with a bitter edge. "You've really got some nerve, you know that?" Helen took a deep breath, her resolve strengthening. She wasn't going to let him provoke her, but it was clear that the battle was far from over. The next morning, David's hostility continued to grow. He refused to contribute to the house, no more taking out the trash or helping with the dishes. His messes piled up, and Helen didn't intervene. She couldn't. The more he pushed, the more determined she became. Emma, now visibly distressed, turned to Helen. "Please, just talk to him," she said, almost pleading. "I don't want to lose you both." Helen met her daughter's gaze, torn. She hated the divide, but she had to stay strong. "I'm not going to back down. I won't let him control me." By the end of the week, the atmosphere in the house was unbearable. David, once passive, was now actively trying to undermine Helen at every turn. She knew it was time to take action. Helen called Sam, the family lawyer, that afternoon. She needed advice, needed to know how to protect herself and her home. After explaining everything, Sam reassured her, though his tone was cautious. "Keep documenting everything, Helen. If he takes this further, you need to be prepared." Helen hung up the phone, a sense of determination filling her. She wasn't going to let David's tantrums tear her down. She'd fought for her peace before, and she would do it again. The situation wasn't over, not by a long shot. But now, she was ready for whatever came next. Helen spent the next few days moving in a quiet, determined rhythm. She had made her decision, and now she needed to prepare. The house had become a battleground, and she wasn't going to let David's passive-aggressive behavior continue unchecked. Each evening, after dinner, she would sit at the kitchen table, organizing documents. The deed to the house, tax records, proof of ownership. She hadn't thought about these papers in years, but now they were crucial. She needed to be ready in case David tried to take things further. The house was hers, but now she had to make sure there were no doubts about it. David's behavior was escalating. His passive-aggressive comments were constant, the messes piling up as if to test her limits. He left dirty dishes, clothes, and trash wherever he could. And every time she asked him to clean up, he would sigh loudly and comply, but not without making a point of how unfair it all was. "Must be nice to have all this space to yourself," he muttered under his breath, his words intended to sting. Helen didn't rise to the bait. She kept her responses measured, refusing to engage. She knew David was trying to provoke her, but she wouldn't let him. The silence in the house was thick, but she was resolute. Emma, however, wasn't unaffected. Helen could see the tension in her daughter's face. Caught between her husband and her mother, her loyalty torn. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, Emma spoke up, her voice small but desperate. "Mom, David's upset. He's feeling humiliated. I think you should at least try to talk to him. Work things out." Helen's chest tightened. She had known this was coming, but hearing it from Emma still stung. "I've already talked to him, Emma," she replied softly but firmly. "I've been patient. I've let him stay here without asking for rent. I've given him space. And this is how he repays me." Emma lowered her gaze, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to lose you both." Helen's heart ached, but she knew there was no other way. "I won't let him control me, Emma. This is my house, and I'm not going to keep bending to his will." Emma was silent, but Helen could feel the weight of her daughter's disappointment. It was becoming harder for Emma to choose a side, and Helen understood that, but she couldn't allow David to continue undermining her. The situation wasn't just affecting her, it was affecting her relationship with Emma. Helen made a decision. She called Sam, the family lawyer. She explained the situation, how David's behavior had crossed a line and how she needed to protect her home. Sam was reassuring but cautious. "Document everything, Helen. If he tries anything, you'll be prepared." She hung up the phone, feeling a sense of determination settle within her. She wasn't going to let David's childish tantrums take over her life. That evening, she sat down with Emma. "This can't go on," she said, her voice steady. "David needs to respect the house, or he needs to leave. I won't keep waiting for things to get better." Emma didn't speak immediately, but Helen saw the understanding in her eyes. The situation was far from over, but Helen was ready. It was time to take control and face whatever came next. David's frustration had been building for days, and when it finally came to a head, it was like a storm breaking. He stormed into the living room, his face flushed with anger. His patience had worn thin, and he wasn't going to let Helen continue to push him around. "You've really gone too far this time," he said, his voice sharp with accusation. "You can't just throw me out like this. You're being completely unreasonable." Helen didn't flinch. She had heard it all before. His attempts to guilt her, to manipulate the situation. But this time, there was no room for compromise. "I'm not throwing you out, David," she replied calmly, her voice unwavering. "But you have no right to treat me like this in my own house." David took a step closer, his fists clenched. "This is my life too. You're ruining the family, Helen. I'm trying to be patient, but you're making it impossible." Helen stood tall, meeting his gaze. "You're the one making it impossible, David. I've been more than patient, but your behavior is unacceptable. This house is mine, and I will not tolerate this disrespect any longer." David's eyes flashed with anger. "You think you can just throw me out? You can't control everything. You're ruining everything. Helen didn't flinch. She walked over to the table and picked up the legal documents she had been preparing. With steady hands, she slid them across the table toward him. "This is my house, David," she said, her voice firm. "I've given you the benefit of the doubt for far too long, but now it's time to face the truth. My name is on the deed. I have every right to make decisions about this house." David picked up the papers, his eyes scanning them quickly, but his expression didn't change. He was still angry, still unwilling to accept what was happening. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, tossing the papers back onto the table. "You can't just treat me like this." Helen stood her ground, her voice unwavering. "I'm not treating you unfairly, David. I'm asking you to respect my home. If you can't do that, then it's time for you to leave." David took a deep breath, trying to control his frustration. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" he asked, his voice quieter now but still laced with resentment. Helen nodded. "I've been serious from the start, but you've crossed a line. I won't tolerate it anymore." David's face twisted with anger and frustration, but he didn't argue further. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked toward the door. The tension in the room was thick, but Helen didn't feel the need to say anything more. She had made her point. She had stood her ground. As the door slammed shut behind him, Emma, who had been watching from the doorway, let out a breath. She had stayed silent, torn between her husband and her mother, but now she finally spoke. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice soft and uncertain. Helen turned to face her daughter, her expression a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "It's over for now," she said quietly. "But this is my house, and I'm not going to let anyone take advantage of me again." Emma nodded slowly, the weight of everything settling in. It wasn't just the end of an argument, it was the beginning of something new. For Helen, it was a sense of peace, of taking back control. But for Emma, the journey was just starting. Helen could feel the weight of the moment, the finality in the air, but there was also a sense of resolve. The confrontation had been hard, but it had been necessary. Now, all she could do was move forward. The house was hers, and with it, her peace. The days after David left were strangely quiet, but Helen knew the peace wouldn't last. She could feel the storm brewing outside her door. It started with a call from David's sister, Susan. Her voice was tight with an edge of irritation. "Helen," she began, her words clipped, "David's a mess. You can't just throw him out like that. He's part of this family. You need to reconsider this. He's hurt, and you're being unreasonable." Helen had anticipated this. She wasn't surprised that David would try to turn family against her, to paint her as the villain. But she wasn't going to let anyone make her second-guess herself. "I haven't thrown him out, Susan. I've asked him to respect the house, and he's chosen to leave. This is my home. I'm not going to let him disrespect me in it anymore." Susan's voice softened, though still tinged with judgment. "It's not that simple. Families stick together, Helen. You're tearing this one apart." Helen took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I've tried to keep the peace for years. This isn't about family loyalty. It's about respect. And David's actions have shown me that he's not willing to give me that." The conversation ended with Susan's hesitant silence, but it was clear this wasn't the end. David's tactics were shifting, but so was Helen's resolve. She knew the truth was on her side, and she wasn't going to let him drag her down. The next day, Emma came to her with a quiet urgency. "David's been calling Mom. He's been telling everyone that you're being cruel. He's trying to turn the whole family against you." Helen's stomach turned, the weight of the betrayal hitting her again. She had never expected things to get this messy, but she wasn't going to back down. "Let him say whatever he wants," she said, her voice firm. "The truth is on my side. He's the one who's been disrespectful." Emma hesitated, the guilt in her eyes lingering. I don't want to lose you both, but I can't stand by and watch him do this to you. You're right. His behavior isn't acceptable. Helen felt a rush of warmth in her chest, a reminder that, despite the strain, her daughter was standing with her. Thank you, Emma, she said quietly. It means more than you know. But as the days passed, David's retaliations grew bolder. He reached out to family members, tried to stir up sympathy, and spread rumors about Helen's actions. But each attempt only highlighted his lack of respect, his inability to take responsibility for his behavior. Family members who had once sided with him now began to distance themselves. One by one, they realized that Helen had been right. She knew she had to keep her distance from the drama, and that's when she made the decision. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, had become a symbol of the chaos David had brought into her life. It was time to move on. Helen contacted Sam, the family lawyer, again. I need to protect myself, she told him. David's trying to manipulate the situation, and I need to secure my rights to the house before he tries anything else. Sam reassured her, laying out the legal steps she needed to take to protect herself. You've got the deed, Helen. Your name is on the property. If it comes to it, we'll make sure David can't take anything from you. The weight lifted slightly, but Helen knew this wouldn't be over until she was truly free. She began looking into selling the house, planning her next steps, knowing that it would be a fresh start. It wasn't just about moving out. It was about moving forward, reclaiming her life from the toxicity that had taken root in her home. One afternoon, as she sat with Emma, going over potential properties to move to, the weight of it all felt a little lighter. The house that had been so full of tension, of arguments and unspoken resentments, would soon be behind them. They were taking control of their lives again, together. Emma looked at her, a faint smile on her face. You know, Mom, I think this is the first time I've seen you really free. You're not just surviving anymore. You're living. Helen smiled back, the ache of everything that had happened still there, but not overwhelming her anymore. It's a new chapter, Emma, and we're going to be all right. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would still be moments of doubt. But for the first time in a long while, Helen felt hopeful. She was reclaiming her peace, her strength, and her future. The drama, the manipulation, the lies, they were all behind her now. And nothing, not even David, could take that away. And with that, Helen knew that her journey was just beginning. Helen sat at the small kitchen table of their new apartment, a modest place filled with light and quiet. The house they'd left behind, with its tension and memories of David, felt miles away now. The sale had gone through, and with it came the chance to rebuild, one step at a time. Emma sat across from her, scrolling through listings on her phone. It had been weeks of searching, but Helen could feel they were finally closing in on something that was truly theirs. This one, Mom, Emma said, showing her the screen. It's small, but it's perfect. Helen leaned over, looking at the apartment. It had a cozy living room, a small kitchen, and a backyard space that Emma had already started planning for. It's perfect, Helen said softly, a smile touching her lips. It's exactly what we need. There was no grand luxury in the apartment, but it was theirs, free from the chaos David had left in its wake. It was a fresh start. With the money from the house sale, Helen had taken a leap she'd put off for years. She opened a small business. She had always dreamed of starting something of her own, something creative. And now, she finally had the freedom to do it. It was a small shop, selling handmade candles and decor. Every item she created felt like a piece of herself, and the sense of pride and independence it gave her was indescribable. I'm so proud of you, Mom, Emma said one night, watching her work in the kitchen, preparing an order. You're really doing it. Helen paused, glancing up from the table where she'd been carefully packaging an order. I couldn't have done it without you, Emma. she replied, a quiet pride in her voice. You've been my strength. The changes in Emma were visible too. She'd settled into a new school, far from the toxic atmosphere David had created. It was like she'd shed a weight, and her confidence was growing. Emma was finding her footing again, and for the first time in years, Helen saw her daughter truly thriving. I'm happy, Mom, Emma said one evening as they sat on the couch. I feel like I can finally breathe again. Helen's heart swelled. This was what she had fought for, to give her daughter the peace and freedom she deserved, and in doing so, reclaim her own life. David, however, hadn't stopped trying to reach her. Messages and calls came in waves, each one trying to draw her back into the old patterns of guilt and manipulation. But Helen wasn't listening anymore. She deleted the messages without a second thought, blocking his number. She didn't need him in her life anymore. The shop was doing well, and Helen felt a sense of accomplishment she hadn't known in years. She was finally doing something for herself, something that had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations or demands. She could see a future now, one she had built herself, step by step. One evening, as she stood at the door of their new home watching the sun dip below the horizon, Emma came up behind her. They stood together, the world outside peaceful and calm. We're really doing it, aren't we? Emma asked, her voice full of wonder. Helen smiled, her heart light. We are, and we're going to make it everything we've dreamed of. The future was wide open now, and for the first time in a long time, Helen felt truly free. The courtroom was tense as Helen sat across from David, her heart steady despite the storm brewing within. This final confrontation would determine everything: her future, her home, and her peace. David, in his sharp suit, looked like a man prepared to fight, but Helen wasn't backing down. David's lawyer spoke first, outlining his claim. Your Honor, my client, Mr. Foster, has lived in this house for years, contributing to its upkeep. He deserves a portion of the property, especially after everything he's done. Helen didn't flinch. She had heard this argument before. She was ready. Her turn came. She stood, pulling out the legal documents with steady hands. Your Honor, this house is mine, she said, her voice unwavering. I've paid for it, maintained it, and it's been in my name for years. David has no claim to it. She slid the deed and tax records across the table. These documents prove my ownership. David's attempts to claim any part of this property are unfounded. David's lawyer was quick to respond, trying to manipulate the situation. But he's lived here, contributed. Helen cut him off, her voice sharp. Living here doesn't give him ownership. He has no legal right to any of it. David's face flushed with anger as he stood to argue, his fists clenched. You can't just throw me out, Helen. This is unfair. The courtroom fell into silence as Helen's lawyer, Sam, intervened. We've presented the facts, Your Honor. There's no legal basis for David's claim. The property is in Helen's name, and that's the law. The judge listened carefully, glancing at the papers in front of him. Helen's hands rested calmly on the table. She had done everything right. The truth was on her side. The silence in the room grew heavy as the judge weighed the evidence. Finally, he spoke. I've reviewed the documents and the arguments presented. The court rules in favor of Helen Foster. The house is hers, and Mr. Foster has no claim to it. Helen exhaled, a quiet relief flooding over her. David stood frozen for a moment, disbelief flickering in his eyes. He opened his mouth to argue, but his lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, urging him to accept defeat. David's eyes shot one last glare at Helen before he turned and stormed out of the courtroom. The tension in the room lifted, and Helen felt the weight of months of conflict lift from her shoulders. Emma, who had been standing quietly in the back of the room, walked toward her mother. She smiled, her voice full of quiet pride. You did it, Mom. You really did it. Helen looked down at her daughter, her heart full. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. The battle was over. The house was hers. The future, finally, was hers to shape. The courtroom's final ruling felt like a door closing firmly behind Helen. She had expected the relief, but the depth of it surprised her, almost as though she'd been holding her breath for months and could finally exhale. David's threats, his manipulations, the endless power struggles, they were no longer her burden. The house was hers, and with it, her future was once again in her hands. Helen sat in her small office, the windows of her new shop casting warm light across the room. It was a modest space, but it felt like a reflection of her life now, bright, simple, full of potential. The handmade candles, pottery, and art she created lined the shelves, each piece a testament to her newfound independence. The business was growing, slowly but surely. Word of mouth had spread, and more customers were coming through the door each day. She was making her own way, not just financially, but emotionally as well. Emma had blossomed too. The new school had been a fresh start for her. The pressure, the toxicity from David, had been lifted, and Emma was thriving. Her confidence had returned. She was making friends, excelling in her studies, and enjoying the freedom to be herself again. It wasn't just the school that had changed for her. It was everything. The weight of the past had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "I'm really proud of you, Mom," Emma said one evening, as they sat together on the couch in their new apartment. The soft glow of the reading lamp lit up her face, and for the first time, Helen saw a peace in her daughter's eyes that hadn't been there for years. Helen smiled, a deep, genuine smile. "I'm proud of you too, Emma. We've both come so far." They were no longer just surviving, they were living. The future, once clouded by doubt and fear, was now wide open. Helen knew that what they had was something precious, an unshakable bond forged through hardship and now filled with the strength to move forward, together. But even as they rebuilt their lives, David's presence lingered in the background. The victory in court hadn't silenced him. He continued to spread rumors, telling anyone who would listen that Helen had taken everything from him. He made veiled threats, sending her anonymous messages, trying to manipulate the situation again. He'd never fully let go, and Helen knew he was desperate. Still, the rumors no longer had the power to touch her. They were just noise, empty words from a man who had nothing left to hold over her. She had cut the strings, and no amount of his manipulation would bring them back. Helen had expected his desperation, but what she hadn't expected was the way it no longer rattled her. She simply let it wash over her, ignored his attempts to stir up trouble. The worst of it was behind her, and the echoes of his threats had no place in her new life. Her peace wasn't for sale anymore. In the evenings, Helen and Emma spent time together planning their future, looking at more property for Emma's new school projects, talking about what was next for the business. There were moments of laughter, of small joys, that Helen had never allowed herself before. They talked about vacations, about places they'd visit once they were fully settled. It was all so different, so much brighter than before. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Helen stood at the window, looking out. Emma joined her, her hand slipping into her mother's. "I'm glad we did this," Emma said softly. "Me too," Helen replied. "We've got so much ahead of us, Emma, and this time, it's our future. No one else's." Helen's heart swelled with pride. She had fought for this peace, for the life she was living now. The past, with all its drama and lies, had been left behind. And as she stood there, beside her daughter, watching the sunset paint the sky, she knew that nothing could take this away from her. The future was hers. And it was finally hers to shape. Helen's shop had become a beacon of her new life, warm, welcoming, and full of possibility. What had started as a small, quiet dream had blossomed into something much bigger. Word spread quickly about her handmade candles, jewelry, and decor. Each piece she crafted was infused with more than just care. They were a reflection of her strength, of her journey from the ashes of her old life into something vibrant and new. As her business grew, so did her sense of purpose. It wasn't just about selling her creations anymore. It was about showing women that they too could reclaim their independence, just as she had. Helen began to receive messages and emails from women, thanking her for the inspiration she had unknowingly provided. It was humbling and powerful. One afternoon, she received an invitation to speak at a women's empowerment conference in another city. Her heart raced as she read the email. She had been invited to share her story, to talk about how she had taken control of her life after years of abuse and manipulation. The opportunity felt surreal, but also like the next step in her journey. When the day of the conference arrived, Helen stood at the podium, her hands gripping the microphone, looking out at the sea of women who had gathered to hear her speak. Her heart thudded in her chest, but the nerves had faded. She knew she belonged there, in that moment, sharing what she had learned. 3 years ago, she began, her voice steady. I was trapped in a cycle of fear, doubt, and manipulation. My life, my home, everything I thought I knew was controlled by someone who didn't value me, but I'm standing here today to tell you that it doesn't have to be that way. You can take back your life. You can rebuild, no matter how broken you feel. The room was silent, everyone listening intently. Helen paused, taking in the faces of the women in the crowd, the hope in their eyes. It took me years to see that I was worthy of more than what I'd accepted. But now I'm living the life I always dreamed of. And if I can do it, so can you. As Helen spoke, she saw a shift in the room. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about them. The women who had been through similar struggles, who had yet to find their voice, were now listening intently. It was a quiet revolution happening in the space between them, and it felt incredible to be part of it. After the speech, women came up to Helen to thank her, some tearfully, some with a quiet strength. They shared their stories, told her how much her words had meant to them. Helen realized with a lump in her throat that the work she was doing was bigger than just her shop. She was part of a network of women empowering each other, breaking free of the chains that had held them down for far too long. Emma was with her, of course, her constant support and source of joy. They had traveled to the city together, and in the evenings they explored, finally able to enjoy life without the constant shadow of fear hanging over them. They visited art galleries, walked through parks, and ate at small cafes, savoring every moment of freedom they could. It was the first time in a long while that Helen had allowed herself to just be, without worrying, without looking over her shoulder. On the way back home, Emma turned to her, her eyes wide with admiration. Mom, I've never seen you so strong. You're changing so many lives. I'm so proud of you. Helen smiled, the words filling her with warmth. I couldn't do it without you, Emma. You've always been my strength. The trip was a turning point for both of them. It wasn't just about escaping the past. It was about embracing the future with open arms, living without fear, and planning for the things they wanted most. Helen had a newfound sense of clarity, of purpose, and she was determined to keep pushing forward. Back home, the money from the house sale had allowed Helen to invest in something else, something close to her heart. She started a foundation to help women escape toxic relationships, offering counseling, legal support, and a safe space for those who needed it most. It was a project she had always wanted to launch, but had never felt strong enough to do. Now, she was pouring everything into it, knowing that it was exactly where her energy needed to go. With every day, Helen felt herself becoming more confident, more sure of who she was and what she stood for. She began mentoring women who had gone through similar struggles, using her own experience to help guide them toward the freedom she had found. The foundation grew, and the stories of women she helped began to inspire even more. Helen's circle of support expanded too. She surrounded herself with like-minded individuals, women who shared her vision, her drive, and her commitment to helping others. They lifted each other up, building a community that was grounded in strength, compassion, and resilience. As the months passed, Helen found herself standing in front of a room full of women once more, this time as a mentor, as someone who had walked the path and now extended a hand to those still finding their way. Her voice, stronger than ever, resonated with the women in front of her, and she knew that her purpose was just beginning. But it wasn't just her voice that was growing, it was her daughter's too. Emma was thriving, finding her own path, and together, they were living the life they had always dreamed of. Their bond, once tested by the storm, was unbreakable now. And as Helen looked out at the faces of the women she was helping, she realized that this was only the beginning. The future was brighter than ever, and it was hers to shape. Helen sat quietly at her desk, the soft light of the afternoon sun spilling across the pages of her journal. The years of turmoil, of living under the weight of David's control, now felt like a distant memory. She had rebuilt her life from the ground up, and with each passing day she grew stronger, more confident in her ability to shape her own future. Looking back, Helen could see how much she had learned through the struggle. When she first left David, she had no idea how she would survive, how she would move forward. But she had. She had learned that strength wasn't always loud. It was quiet. It was steady. And it was rooted deep within her. Every challenge she faced had chipped away at her fears, revealing a woman who was more capable, more resilient than she had ever realized. She thought about the pain David had caused, the manipulation, the lies. It had been so much to endure, but it had also been a catalyst for change. The pain had pushed her to the point where she could no longer tolerate being controlled. It forced her to find the courage to step away, to reclaim her life, her voice, and her peace. And in that process, Helen had discovered her own power. She had rebuilt not just her business, but her entire sense of self. Every candle she made, every piece of jewelry she crafted, was infused with the lessons she had learned through that painful chapter. Her shop was more than just a business. It was a reflection of her journey, of her ability to create something beautiful out of the chaos. Emma, too, had flourished. In the environment Helen had worked so hard to create, one free from fear, one filled with love and support, Emma had grown into the confident young woman Helen had always hoped she would become. Their bond had only grown stronger through the process. They had built a new life together, one where they could laugh, dream, and live without the shadow of David looming over them. Helen smiled as she thought of her daughter, who had found her own strength, who had learned from her mother's example. They had done this together. And now, their future was wide open. Taking a deep breath, Helen knew she had found something even more precious than independence: peace. It wasn't just about moving on from the past. It was about truly embracing the life she had built and allowing herself to fully experience the joy, the freedom, and the possibility that now filled her days. She had come to realize that her journey was far from over. She had already written so much of her story, but she knew there was more to be told. It was time to share it, to help others who were still trapped in the situation she had once found herself in. She decided to write a book, one that would tell her story, offer hope, and show others that they, too, could take control of their lives. But before she dove into that, Helen promised herself that she would take time to enjoy the life she had worked so hard to build. She traveled, she explored, and she savored the moments of peace. The world was wide open to her now, and when she looked ahead, there was no fear. There was only excitement, confidence, and the knowledge that the future was hers to shape. She had faced the worst, and now she was living her best life. Nothing would ever take that from her again. The weight of the past had finally lifted. Helen stood in the quiet of her small shop, the peaceful hum of the place filling the air, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. The chaos David had tried to bring into her life was gone. His shadow, once long and heavy, was now a distant memory. She had fought for this peace, and it was hers to keep. Her business was thriving, but the frantic drive for success that once consumed her was now replaced by a gentler pace. The shop, filled with candles, art, and handmade jewelry, had become more than a source of income. It was her sanctuary, her place of creation. It was a reflection of her new life. She worked at her own pace, finding joy in the process rather than the pressure to build. Every candle she made was a quiet act of self-expression. Emma, too, was flourishing. She had settled into her new school, free from the toxic cloud that had once hung over her life. She was making new friends, excelling in her studies, and most importantly, she was happy. The girl who once carried the weight of divided loyalties now walked with her head high, her confidence restored. Their bond, forged through the fire of hardship, had grown stronger than ever. At home, life had taken on a rhythm that Helen cherished. Simple moments, a quiet morning with coffee, evenings spent cooking dinner together, and long walks through the neighborhood were now the foundation of their lives. They were no longer just surviving, they were living fully in the present, without fear or regret. For the first time, Helen allowed herself to enjoy what she had built. The echoes of David's manipulations were no longer able to touch her. When she thought back to the days of constant anxiety, she couldn't help but marvel at how far she had come. And yet, even as the peace settled in, Helen felt a calling to do more. She wanted to help others, women who had been where she once was. Her experiences, her journey, had shown her the power of community, of lifting each other up. She became more involved in local outreach, offering support to women rebuilding their lives after toxic relationships. She shared her story, listened to others, and created a space for healing. It felt good to give back, to know that her strength could be a lifeline for someone else. Helen had learned that true peace came not just from moving on, but from sharing what you had learned along the way. It was a ripple effect, one that she knew could change lives. One evening, as Helen and Emma sat together watching the sunset from their balcony, Emma spoke quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. "I'm so proud of us, Mom," Emma said, her voice filled with a quiet sense of wonder. Helen smiled, her heart full. "Me too, sweetheart. We've come so far." And in that moment, looking out at the peaceful horizon, Helen knew that the storm was behind them. The future was theirs to shape, and nothing, not even the remnants of the past, could take the peace they had created from them. Helen sat at her desk, watching as the last light of the day filtered through the window. Her foundation had grown far beyond what she had ever imagined. It had started as a small idea, a way to help women escape toxic relationships. Now it was a lifeline for hundreds, offering shelter, counseling, and hope. The weight of her journey, from pain to empowerment, was now manifesting in the work she did every day. She looked at the reports in front of her. Donations were up, and the programs she had developed were expanding. The foundation wasn't just a place for women to find refuge. It was a place for them to rebuild, to reclaim their power. It was everything she had hoped for when she first started this path, but so much more. Emma, now a teenager, had become her right hand. She had grown into a strong, capable young woman, one who not only helped at the foundation but had also started to mentor the younger girls who came through their doors. Helen watched with pride as Emma worked, seeing the same strength she had once fought to cultivate in herself blossoming in her daughter. "Mom," Emma said one evening, coming into the office, "we've been getting more requests for help lately. I think we need to expand our outreach." Helen smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You're right. Let's make that our next goal." The bond they shared was stronger than ever. The life they had built together, one free from the manipulations of David, was now full of promise. Emma had found her purpose in helping others, just as Helen had. Together, they were creating a ripple effect, touching more lives than they ever imagined. Helen's impact extended beyond the foundation. She was invited to speak at conferences, to share her story with others who were fighting their own battles. Each time she stood before an audience, her voice steady and clear, she felt more connected to the women who had walked similar paths. It wasn't just about healing anymore. It was about empowerment. It was about showing women that they had the strength to create their own futures, that they could break free from the chains of their past. Every story shared, every tear wiped away, was a reminder of why she had started this journey. Helen's story had become something much bigger than just her. It was a movement that helped women heal, find independence, and reclaim their lives. As her reach grew, so did her sense of purpose. She knew she wasn't just changing her own life, she was changing the lives of countless others. The future, once uncertain, now felt full of possibility. Helen looked around the office at the team that had come together to support the mission. She had created something lasting, something that would outlast her. Her legacy wasn't just in the foundation, it was in every woman who found the courage to leave behind a life of fear and walk toward their own future. And as she glanced over at Emma, her partner in this journey, Helen felt a deep sense of peace. They had come so far together, and the path ahead was brighter than ever. The air in the office felt light as Helen reviewed the latest reports. The foundation was growing, the business was thriving, and for the first time in years, her life felt completely her own. Every decision she made now was a choice for the future, one that was built on her own terms. The shop had become more than just a place to create. It had become a symbol of her resilience. The handmade pieces, candles, pottery, jewelry, were more than just objects. They were tokens of her strength, each crafted with intention, reflecting the journey she had taken. She often found herself standing in the front window, looking out at the world, thinking about how far she'd come. The woman who once feared the future was now the woman shaping it. Helen had set new goals, both for her business and her foundation. She was offering scholarships to women who wanted to rebuild their lives, providing financial support and mentorship to those who needed it most. The business wasn't just about profit anymore. It was about empowerment. Every sale was a reminder that she was creating something lasting, something that would help others in ways she hadn't even imagined when she first started. It wasn't just about her success. It was about the legacy she was building. The foundation had begun to impact communities outside her city, helping more women than she could have ever dreamed. She had become a leader in her own right, not just within the foundation, but in the larger movement to empower women to take control of their futures. Helen had come to realize that her true wealth wasn't measured in money, but in the lives she touched, the women who had found strength through her example. But it was the moments with Emma that filled her heart the most. They spent their evenings together, talking about dreams for the future, places they wanted to visit, experiences they wanted to share. They had already traveled to a few places, marking the beginning of the adventures they had always talked about. Helen had given Emma the freedom to choose her own path, but they both knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, they would face it together. One evening, as they sat on the balcony, the sun setting over the city, Emma turned to her mother, a quiet smile on her face. "Mom," Emma said softly, "we've made it. You've made it." Helen smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "We've made it, Emma. We've always been stronger together." The truth of it settled in. A life built not on wealth or accolades, but on love, empowerment, and peace. She had everything she had ever wanted. The foundation was thriving, the business was flourishing, and most importantly, Helen and Emma had each other. They had created something that would last, a legacy of strength and independence that would continue long after they were gone. Helen looked out at the horizon, feeling the weight of her journey, but also the exhilaration of what lay ahead. The future was wide open. The pain of the past no longer lingered. It had been replaced by the unshakable peace she had fought so hard to find. She had no idea where life would take her next, but for the first time, she didn't need to know. She was living fully in the present, embracing each moment as it came. "They tried to take everything from me," Helen thought to herself, her smile widening as the final line of her journey played out in her mind. "But they never took my peace." And with that, Helen knew. No matter what came next, she was ready. She had everything she ever needed to face it, and with Emma by her side, there was nothing she couldn't conquer.